pretty bad when the dog doesn't want to come with me. This is Jimmy. Good boy. Yeah. Fantastic. Beautiful. Good morning. What do you think about when you see me? Hang on to that for a second. I was born in New Zealand. My dad was an Australian, my mum was a New Zealander. They met, fell in love on a holiday dalliance, and I was the second born in my family. A few years later we came to live in Australia. My mum was one of 11 siblings, and she left that all behind. She didn't have her mum or any of her family, and we came to Australia. My dad was a police officer, and he saw things that no human being should see. It affected him so bad that he started to drink. He couldn't talk about what he had seen, so he drank to try and forget what he had seen. It wasn't long before that time, it wasn't long after that time, that things started to get very tough in my family. We went from being an average everyday family to a family that lived with domestic abuse, domestic violence, and it could erupt like that. We could be sitting at the dinner table, just like thousands of families in our community, and all of a sudden plates were flying, people were running, and kids were scared. And we lived like that for quite some time, until my mum thought, you know what, I can't take this anymore, and she decided that she was getting out of this life. Fortunately for my mum, she was found in time, and she's very happy living a full life in New South Wales today. From that point on, I was this kid that had a lot of anxiety. Some of the advantages of living in that time and living that way is you became a really good observer of body language. There were certain things that I could see in my dad that told me that we were in trouble. And there were certain ways that my mum would look at my dad that told me that we were in for a pretty bumpy ride. But of course I was just a kid. I didn't know how to cope with that. So I began to eat. And I began to eat sugary things that made me feel good. And as you can see, I still lived with the consequences of that road. When I was in year 6, finally, my parents decided to go their separate ways. And it was interesting, I can remember thinking to myself, I am so relieved that I don't have to live like this anymore. But at the same time, I was devastated because I was my father's daughter and we were now moving away from him. He was this man I idolised. Even in his own imperfection, I idolised him. He was a man of wisdom and courage and brokenness all at the same time. So we moved and we had to go into hiding because my dad wasn't really very impressed about everybody leaving, and I can remember we left the family dogs, which for all us kids was incredibly devastating, and we lived in fear for quite some time. We had to keep moving because we didn't have any family in Australia, so we were basically on the poverty line, and we'd get a house and then they'd put up the rent and we'd have to move, and that went. I think we worked out in the first 18 years of my life, or after my parents divorced, we moved 21 times, and twice because my father had found out where we lived. My dad disengaged and I barely saw him from that time on, and that was really soul-destroying for me. Year 6, Catholic school education, having a great time, all-girls school. Now I'm going to a co-ed system. We used to wear skirts right down to our ankles at the Catholic Church, and I'm sure you can imagine. This is now in the 1970s of New South Wales, and it was a very different scene. For those of you that laugh, I'll know how old you are. I arrived my first school day with a Stanley Stanford briefcase and my skirt down to my ankles. And I stuck out like a sore thumb. I almost got beaten up my first day of school. I still don't understand why. But to survive, I had to adapt, improvise and overcome, which I did. And it wasn't long before I attracted the attention of the cool crowd. I was a little bit different, a little bit quirky, and I was invited in. But they did some not so nice things to people, and now I was a part of this group, part of this pack, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was connected. I was part of something bigger than myself. But they weren't the most healthiest pack in the world. There was drinking and drugs and boys and taking off from school. And although that really didn't appeal to me, I had this connection. I felt like people cared about me. So I let down my guard and away we went. A few years into high school, the girl that was in charge of this group, the pack leader so to speak, the top dog, she decided just randomly that this girl, who I didn't know from a bar of soap, was going to be in trouble and they were going to fight her at lunchtime just because they can. And there was something inside of me that didn't sit right with. So we ended up having this big argument. I lost my friend, I lost my group, and I went back to feeling all alone in the big world. The interesting thing is, the girl that they were going to beat up, we became very good friends, and over time we're still in touch today. But here I was, disconnected again. High school was not the most pleasant experience for the fat kid. It's a lot better now, I'm told, but at that time, it's a complicated place. Got out of school, I failed my HSC, had no prospects. I couldn't even get Franklin's to give me a job. What was the point? I started binge drinking, doing all those things that you do when you're just trying to mitigate the pain. And I was lost. I was terribly, terribly lost. This went on for about 5 years, and I finally got to the place where I was just exhausted with life. When I was 2, I drowned and I was clinically dead on arrival at hospital. And I used to have this fight with God. You know, if this was the best that life was going to be, why didn't you just let me die then? Why have I had to come through all this pain and misery if this is the best it gets? And I was so angry that I was put in this position. When there was an out, there was a doorway I could have walked through. I was already dead. And I was angry at the next door neighbour that saw me floating in the water. You know, how dare he jump in and save me? Now I've got to do this thing called life. Anyway, it was a place where I just felt like I was all on my own. I used to go up, my younger brother, my stepfather wasn't a very nice man either. He played a lot of psychological games. So I can remember one time something had been broken in the house and I knew I hadn't done it. But by the end of that day, he'd convinced me I had. So it was just tough. Growing up was tough, and I couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. My younger brother moved out. He's 8 years younger than I am. And he came and lived with me for a while. And that was nice. That was nice to have a sense of family and a sense of connection. And we had a great time. And I became like his surrogate mum. I'd always kind of felt guilty. I'd left him in the place that I'd left him. So I'd run him around to basketball and pick him up after school. And I used to wait for him in the library. Not because I knew anything really about libraries, but just because he was actually a really good student, and I would pick him up, and then we would go home. And I can remember sitting one day, he was late, and he hadn't told me he was going to be late, and I'm sitting in this place with a whole heap of books. I know it's the library, but apart from that, it really served no purpose for me. And I picked up this white book, and it was the Who's Who of Australia in the reference section, and I just opened it just because I was bored, and I started to read story after story of human beings that had faced really tough times, come out the other end, and done something amazing with their lives, changed something, grew in some way, helped somebody. And I can remember this day I started crying over this book. Who am I? I'm never going to amount to anything. I don't even really think I should be here. I've got no purpose, I've got no sense of community. I'm wanting out. Where's the train to get me out? And that's when things started to change. I found a pack. The first doorway was a church, and people seemed to really care. And I started to feel like I was getting some healing. I was starting to see some things, and in spite of the fact that I was the epitome of an underdog, I'd also made a truckload of really poor choices. I started to find my feet. People started to believe in me. People started to see promise in me that I couldn't even see. My next doorway through was a place called Righteous Pups. Here was this group of people that were trying to do something beautiful with nothing. They had no money, they had no space, but they wanted to work with kids that were struggling. They wanted to help kids with autism find a friend like Jimmy. And they were doing it on their own time, often in their own cars, with their own dollars, and it was beautiful. And I started to realise that a big part of what I was missing was that sense of being connected. Every underdog needs a pack. And over the years, just checking the time, over the years, I've found that that sense of community, it can come being the captain of a football team, or the lady that runs the tuck shop that looks after all the kids that don't have enough money. It can be whatever manifestation or expression you like. But we are not individuals designed to be little islands. We're interconnected. We're designed to work together and to work for one another and to work for the ones that can't work for themselves. And what I've found in community, what I've found in the packs that I've been a part of, is that when you give your life away, you find your place, you find your purpose, you find your pride, and you find your pack. Every underdog needs a pack. And we're all underdogs in one way or another. Find your pack, give your life away. You won't regret it.